Openness is often idealized as freedom, expansion, or spiritual maturity. But for the nervous system, openness can feel profoundly unsafe. This is not because openness is inherently dangerous, but because it removes the structures that once ensured survival. When the body has learned safety through control, vigilance, or contraction, openness represents the loss of what kept it intact. The nervous system organizes itself around predictability. Tension, bracing, and mental control create a sense of orientation, something to hold on to. Even when these strategies are exhausting or painful, they are familiar. Openness, by contrast, feels unbounded. There is no clear edge, no immediate action, no effort to maintain. For a system shaped by threat or overwhelm, this absence can register as exposure rather than relief. Fear arises not because something bad is happening, but because the usual signals of safety are gone. Control relaxes. Monitoring decreases. Readiness softens. Without these markers, the body may interpret openness as vulnerability without protection. Sensations intensify, emotions surface, and awareness widens faster than the system can integrate. What looks like resistance is often a reflexive attempt to re-establish containment. This is why openness cannot be imposed or pursued through will. When the nervous system fears openness, it is not rejecting truth or growth, it is protecting coherence. Safety must be felt before openness can be tolerated. As regulation increases and the body learns it can remain intact without control, openness stops feeling like disappearance. It becomes inhabitable. Only then does surrender cease to feel like a threat and begin to feel like rest. Predictability is not a preference of the mind, it is a requirement of the nervous system. The body organizes safety through what can be anticipated, repeated, and prepared for. Patterns, routines, familiar emotional states, and even recurring problems provide a sense of orientation. They allow the system to brace, respond, and remain coherent in time. When experience follows a known sequence, the body knows how to stay intact. This attachment to predictability persists even when the patterns themselves are painful or limiting. A familiar discomfort is often tolerated more easily than an unfamiliar ease.
The nervous system does not evaluate situations based on comfort or happiness. It evaluates them based on known outcomes. Predictability signals survival. Uncertainty, even when benign, can register as threat because it removes the body's ability to prepare. Control, resistance, and mental planning often arise as attempts to preserve predictability. By managing outcomes, rehearsing scenarios, or holding tension, the system maintains a sense of continuity. These strategies are not failures of trust or awareness. They are stabilizing functions developed in response to past overwhelm. When life begins to open, soften, or become less controlled, these same strategies may intensify, not because something is wrong, but because the familiar reference points are disappearing. Letting go of predictability can feel like losing the ground beneath one's feet. The body may experience anxiety, restlessness, or a pull to recreate old patterns simply to regain orientation. This is why change that moves faster than the nervous system's capacity often leads to self-sabotage or collapse. Safety must be established not through certainty of outcome, but through the body's growing ability to remain present within the unknown. Only then can predictability loosen without triggering threat, and openness emerge without destabilization. The need to control experience does not arise from preference or personality. It emerges from the nervous system's attempt to prevent overwhelm. Control creates a sense of safety by narrowing attention, managing outcomes, and limiting exposure to uncertainty. When past experiences have exceeded the body's capacity to process, control becomes a stabilizing strategy, one that helps the system remain organized and functional. From a somatic perspective, control is not an error to be corrected, but a signal of protective intelligence. Planning, tension, vigilance, and mental rehearsal are ways the body ensures continuity in the face of potential threat. Even spiritual striving, self-improvement, or constant self-regulation can function as subtle forms of control, maintaining a sense of agency when openness feels unsafe. Releasing control cannot be achieved through decision or insight alone. When control is forced to drop, the nervous system often responds with anxiety, collapse, or renewed gripping. The system has learned that control equals safety. Letting go without sufficient regulation feels like exposure without protection. This is why attempts to surrender prematurely often reinforce the very patterns they aim to dissolve. As somatic capacity increases, control naturally loosens. The body begins to discover that sensation, emotion, and uncertainty can be experienced without overwhelm.
Presence becomes more stable, not because vigilance has ended, but because it is no longer required. Control gives way not to chaos, but to responsiveness. Action becomes quieter, timing more accurate, and effort less forced. True release is not the absence of structure or intention. It is the absence of unnecessary protection. When the nervous system no longer needs to manage experience, it can participate fully in it. In this state, life is no longer controlled, it is met. Surrender is often misunderstood as a choice, an attitude, or a spiritual act of will. From a somatic perspective, surrender is none of these. It is a physiological event that arises when the nervous system no longer needs to protect itself. The body does not surrender because it is instructed to, convinced to, or inspired to. It surrenders because safety has become sufficiently established. When the nervous system has been shaped by threat, unpredictability, or overwhelm, control and resistance serve as stabilizing functions. These patterns do not dissolve through insight or effort. They dissolve when the body learns, through lived experience, that it can remain present without bracing, monitoring, or managing what arises. Surrender emerges as a response to regulation, not as a technique imposed from above. Somatically, surrender is felt as a softening rather than a release. Muscular holding eases without collapsing. Attention widens without scattering. Sensation becomes inhabitable instead of urgent. The system remains organized while letting go of unnecessary effort. This distinguishes surrender from shutdown or dissociation, which also involve letting go but at the cost of presence and coherence. Crucially, surrender arises in increments. The nervous system tests safety gradually, allowing small moments of openness, rest, or non-interference. These moments integrate only when the body discovers that nothing bad follows. Over time, this learning accumulates. The system updates its expectations and no longer assumes that openness leads to danger. True surrender is not passive or inert. It is deeply responsive. When protection is no longer required, perception sharpens, action becomes more precise, and timing aligns naturally.
Surrender, in this sense, is not giving up control, it is the absence of the need for it. It is the body's quiet recognition that it can remain intact within experience, exactly as it is. Openness becomes the new baseline not through effort, practice, or repeated intention, but through a gradual reorganization of the nervous system. As protection softens and control is no longer required, the body begins to rest in a wider range of experience without bracing. What once felt exposing or destabilizing becomes ordinary. Openness is no longer an event, it is the background condition from which life is met. In this state, the nervous system is not constantly orienting toward threat, prediction, or management. Attention remains available without needing to narrow. Sensation can arise without urgency. Emotion moves without overwhelming the system. The body stays organized while allowing experience to unfold as it is. This does not mean that difficulty disappears, but that difficulty no longer demands contraction as a default response. When openness becomes baseline, effort reduces naturally. Action arises from responsiveness rather than control. Decisions feel simpler, not because outcomes are certain, but because the body no longer requires certainty in order to proceed. The system trusts its capacity to meet what arises in real time. This trust is somatic, not conceptual. It is built from repeated experiences of remaining intact within uncertainty. Importantly, openness as baseline is not a fragile or elevated state. It is resilient and grounded. Boundaries still exist, but they are fluid rather than rigid. Engagement with the world becomes more accurate because perception is less distorted by defense. The nervous system can move between activation and rest without losing coherence. This marks a fundamental shift in orientation. Life is no longer something to be managed, resisted, or controlled. It is something the body is available for. Openness, once feared, becomes the quiet condition of safety itself. A stable platform from which presence, creativity, and participation naturally unfold. Protection ends not because it is abandoned, but because it is no longer required.
From a somatic perspective, presence does not emerge through effort, discipline, or sustained attention. It emerges when the nervous system recognizes that the conditions which once demanded protection are no longer present. Only then can the body release its readiness to brace, monitor, or manage experience. For much of life, the nervous system is organized around preventing threat. Tension, control, vigilance, and anticipation function as protective layers that ensure survival. These layers are not mistakes or obstacles to presence U-2014, they are the very mechanisms that made presence impossible when safety was absent. The body cannot rest into awareness while it is still tasked with defense. When protection begins to end, it does so gradually. The nervous system tests moments of safety, allowing brief intervals where effort is reduced and attention softens. In these moments, presence is not practiced, it appears. Sensation becomes clearer, perception steadies, and awareness feels less effortful because the body is no longer dividing its resources between experience and protection. This shift does not result in passivity. When protection ends, responsiveness increases. The system remains alert without being vigilant, engaged without being braced. Action arises more cleanly because it is no longer distorted by fear or control. Presence becomes functional rather than elevated, a practical state that supports accurate perception and timely response. Importantly, protection does not disappear entirely. It becomes contextual rather than constant. The nervous system retains its capacity to mobilize when needed, but it no longer lives there. This marks the transition from survival-based organization to presence-based living. When protection ends, presence does not have to be achieved. It is revealed as what remains when nothing needs to be defended.